What is up, everyone? I am TST's the Mudman, and it's time to figure out what we are going to do this weekend in Gods Unchained. So, we have not received any balance patches in this past week, and there is a clear best god in the meta. It is obviously Light. As you can see, we're on gudex.com. We're looking at god popularity at Mythic ranked over the past 7 days, and we can see Light is not only the only god with a positive win rate, it's also the most popular god at 27% of the meta, followed by Nature, then War, and Deception, Magic, and Death pulling up the rear, which makes a lot of sense. Light is definitely the strongest god, and over this past week, we found out that we were probably not going to be receiving any balance patch until early next month when the next set comes out. So a lot of players who have been avoiding purchasing some of these very strong light cards, foreseeing a nerf shortly in the future, has found out that there will be no nerf. So if you've been thinking about buying those wrong paths or those vexing vicars, but you didn't want to get burned on the nerf, you can pick those up, and they'll probably be just as broken as they are now for the next month. So lots of players have been purchasing those very powerful new light cards, like Vexing Vicar, like the Maces, like the Militant Theist. And you can see that reflected in the god popularity. So like I said, we're right now at Mythic rank for the past 7 days. Let's shorten the search parameters to last 3 days and look at god popularity. So, as you can see, Light is still the best god, obviously, but it is slightly more popular on the 3-day chart compared to the 1 week, and as you can see, all the other gods subsequently fall. But then it gets really interesting when you look at the 1-day Mythic ranked meta. And keep in mind, today is Thursday, the day right before the weekend ranked is going to start, so presumably a lot of people are practicing the deck they want to play over the weekend ranked event. And as you can see on the, in the 1-day version, Light is about 40% of the meta, then Nature at 20%, everything else floating around 10%. So what this tells us is, obviously Light is incredibly strong. It's definitely the best god, but it also tells you that we are going to be running into predominantly Light over this weekend ranked event. So when you are thinking about what deck you're going to play, if you're not playing Light, you've got to be thinking of how you are going to counter Light. But before we get into any deck lists, let's talk about each god and what type of archetype you can expect to see when you run into them on the ladder. So Light is obvious. They are always some sort of board-centric Zoolite. They probably go up to 7 mana where they play Zealous March, and Zealous March is not fair, so they will win, with a few corner case, exceptions. Then Nature, which is generally aggressive mid-range Nature. The Nature decks have started running things like Sudden Bloom as well as Feral Shapeshifter as an attempt to counter Light. Magic, the two best performing archetypes for Magic are the Dralamir or Archmea, Miracle combo Magic decks, as well as Portal Wrangler Magic. However, those are not the most prevalent Magic decks. You're probably going to see some sort of Tempo Magic or Ramp Magic, if any. However, when the weekend rank starts and people are only playing those top-performing decks, when you see a Magic deck over the weekend, it's probably going to be some sort of Aether Snap Miracle Magic. Then for Deception, we're going to be seeing predominantly some sort of aggressive Deception, whether it be all Hidden Rush, Super Face, or some sort of Order aggression. But then, of course, there's also Controlled Deception, which is not very prevalent, but it's one of the few archetypes that's actually favored against Light. Death, of course, has Zombie Death and Board Wipe Death. Those are Death's only 2 archetypes. Board Wipe Death is currently better than Zombie Death, but far less prevalent than Zombies. And then War is predominantly aggressive Slayer War, but can also be mid-range Control War. So, now that we have talked about the general meta, let's jump into some specific decks you might want to play this weekend. Let's start things off with the most popular as well as the strongest god in Light. This was the best performing Light list from last weekend ranked event. This list was made by 5 S's, and we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about Light because Light is fairly linear. Most decks are very similar. You have your fairly strong 1-mana creatures in your Aging Veterans, your Drider Sailweavers, your Pacifists, your Vanguard Axewomen to a lesser extent, and all of those aforementioned cards are really great candidates to be buffed by your Shield Bearers, Felid Janissaries, as well as Militant Theists. These, little buff creatures, not only do they turn those minimally threatening creatures into big threat creatures, but there are also creatures on the board that you can capitalize on with in the mid game with your Radiant Dawns and or your Asteriuses. Holy Enchanter as well is really great for those, making those tiny little creatures into big threat creatures. You have other amazingly powerful cards, of course, like your Mace and your Levies. We got Porphyrions in here because this is a great card to buff. Manosian Infiltrator is great in the mirror. Athenian Archer is good for popping wards, protecteds, making it so one of these one-attack creatures can destroy a two-attack creature, which is common since light is so common. There's lots of acolytes floating around. It's a pretty standard zoo deck. You play creatures, you buff creatures, you take value trades, you go face, you win most of your games. If you have the light cards to play a list similar to this one, you will perform very well. Light is the best god for good reason. It's just really strong. So if you like light, you will do great this weekend, and I suggest running a list like this. Next up we have Nature. This aggressive mid-range Nature list was made by Soul Reaper JJ and was the best performing Nature list over last weekend's weekend ranked event. This list is nearly identical to the Nature list we showed off last week, so I'm not going to go over it in great detail. The only thing I really want to focus on while we're talking about Nature is this combo right here, the Feral Shapeshifter as well as the 2 copies of Sudden Bloom. If you have been following the meta closely this past week, you will probably have noticed that the Shapeshifter and Sudden Bloom have become Nature staples. Almost every single Nature deck nowadays runs this Feral Shapeshifter Sudden Bloom combo, as opposed to running like something like the Hunt or any of Nature's other 6-mana AoE options. The reason that is you'll probably remember it from our discussions about the Deception archetype, but Light has a very hard time dealing with hidden creatures, and they have lots of ward as well as high health stuff. So if you can play a Feral Shapeshifter, Light probably won't be able to interact with it, and then you can give it +4/+4, Twin Strike, and Overkill, which will be very, very effective for destroying your Light opponent's boards. A similar thing can be said with Aggro War. Aggro War also has a fairly hard time dealing with hidden creatures. If they are control-y, they have their Soul Survivors and Canopy Barrage, and Cardin Sweeps to deal with Feral Shapeshifters. But Slayer War is far more common, and Slayer War has a really hard time destroying Feral Shapeshifter, and use that same combination of Shifter plus Bloom to clear your opponent's board, as well as establish a giant creature that will inevitably beat your aggressive opponent. So, we talked about this pretty much exact Nature list last week, so we're not going to talk about that. But the important takeaway from Nature is the Feral Shapeshifter Sudden Bloom package is really common, and it's very successful in this current meta. So if you play Nature, I know a lot of people love Nature, you're going to want to consider putting this combo in order to combat the strongest decks in the meta. Next up, we've got Control Deception. This list was made by Caution Fun, and Control Deception is unique in the meta right now because it is the only control deck that is favored against Light. It's also very good against Nature, which are 2 of the more popular gods in the meta right now, so it is a very strong deck. It has its good matchup against Light primarily because of cards like Stoneskin Poison, which is a cheap removal card that doesn't care about things like Ward. The same thing is true with Mugging. It's one of the few ways to deal with a Vexing Vicar on curve. Toasted Piece is a pseudo AoE that also doesn't care about things like Ward or Protected. The same is true with Elixir of the Snakes. This is a particularly important card for the meta. It's one of the few ways to deal with a Zealous March. It also can deal with things like Highborn Knight. It's very powerful in the Light matchup. Of course, you have your Rapture Dances and whatnot. However, one thing that Control Deception has a hard time dealing with is Aggro War as well as Zombie Death. And Caution has combated those 2 archetypes, the War archetype, by adding extra front lines. As you can see, not only do we have the staple ones in Pyramid Warden and Guild Enforcer, but we've also got 2 copies of Bronze Gates in here. Bronze Gate is not good in the Light matchup, of course, because it can be Light's levied, but it's very strong in the War matchup, just putting down front lines turn after turn to help you survive long enough to get to those 6-mana AoEs and then subsequent demos to lock your opponent out of the game. We've also got 2 copies of Iron-Tooth Goblin here, which is obviously very strong against War's Relics as well as Light's Mace, but is primarily here to destroy Zombie Death's Necroceptors, because control decks have a very hard time controlling decks where they have multiple cards that make infinite creatures. So you've got to have an answer to deal with those zombies if you're playing a control deck, hence the 2 Iron Tooth Goblins. And another card that's definitely worth mentioning is Screams in the Night, a new core set refresh card. It is a 3-mana spell. You draw 2 creatures from your deck. If one of them is a Nether, you draw another Nether. In this deck, we have a copy of Deterra, as well as That Which Aches, 2 Demos, and 2 Witherfingers. And as you can see from the composition of the deck, there are very few creatures in here, so that is more than enough Nethers to essentially guarantee that your Screams of the Night will almost always be a 3-mana draw 3. And, you're going to be getting Nethers, which are, you might get 2 Demos or a Demo and a Witherfingers, very high impact cards that likely synergize. And then another thing that might be interesting to note is the Deterra. Usually these control decks use Jason in order to combat fatigue. Deterra is of course a Nether, which works well with the Screams of the Night, but it also pairs really nicely with Toast-a-Piece when you're in those value matchups. So you can play, your Deterra, Toast-a-Piece, Deterra again, Toast-a-Piece, and have a whole bunch of Deterras in your deck that you can use to overwhelm your opponent. It's also really cool when you play a late game Screams of the Night and you draw 3 1-mana 5/5 Deterras. That's always neat. The That Which Aches is also here to beat other control decks, the Mirror Match or Board Wipe Death, or maybe even Ramp Magic, although Ramp Magic is not particularly common. But this is a way to not only make a board full of 3/1s that may or may not be threatening to your opponent, but it also just guarantees that you can't lose in fatigue. If you're a control player, if you like playing control decks, this is definitely the control deck to play this week. It's one of the only archetypes, it's the only control archetype, rather, that's actually favored against light. And Caution's List here has done a pretty good job, in my opinion at least, in combating its poor matchups in Aggro War and Zombie Death. So if you've got a collection to make a similar deck to this one, and you're trying to fight the meta, beat the light decks, I think this could be a great choice for this weekend ranked event. And now let's move on to Magic. This is an Aether Snap Miracle Magic deck made by Nekarub. It is very similar to the deck we showed off last week, popularized by Frozen. The main difference is this deck has put in 2 Warped Engineers to make one of your powerful 2-mana spells, like one of your Bolts, or maybe even one of your 3-mana spells into a 1-mana spell to make it easier to pair with your Archmea for your big miracle combo turns. So let's talk about this combo. It is the Archmea plus Aether Snap combo. So what you are doing is you're trying to make your Aether Snap cost 0 with the help of your helpful Aether Fox. Then you can play Archmea followed by your 0-mana Aether Snap, refreshing 1 mana, so that you can play cards like Dimension Door to cycle through more of your deck, activate those pings on those static Aether Bugs, and just have a big cycle-y miracle turn. It's not exactly like the Dralimar decks of 2 weeks ago. When you have your big miracle turn, you'll rarely be OTKing your opponent. What you will be doing is building a board full of ward creatures, removing your opponent's side of the board, as well as dealing a good chunk of damage to their face. So you won't be winning the turn that you do your miracle most of the time, but you will be setting yourself up for the win by having a very difficult to deal with board state. In the early game, you're playing very conservatively, mostly control-based. You're using your Star Shard Bolts, your Blizzard Bolts, your Forms of Power to control your opponent's side of the board. You're also trying to do your best to draw cards with your Palace's Wand, your Crams, as well as taking some of your higher impacts, cheap spells like Ancient Text, as well as that aforementioned Form of Power or Dimension Door, and making them cost 0 with your Assistant Alchemist. 0-mana spells are particularly valuable in this archetype because when you play them with Archmea, you just get a bonus mana. So if you can play 2 0-mana spells, it leaves you open to play something like a natural 2-mana Blizzard Bolt and then go back to your 1-mana Miracling. Essentially, it's a really fun deck. It's another deck that actually has a positive win rate against light, but just like Deception, it has a very hard time dealing with aggressive Slayer War. But unlike Deception, they can't really tech their deck to beat Slayer War. You just gotta hope your Slayer War opponent whiffs, or you just draw the nuts and do your miracle very early. But this is a really fun, high-octane deck. It's it's fun to go from being very defensive to flipping the switch and having a big miracle turn. It's definitely not going to be as powerful or consistent as something like Light will be this weekend, but it'll definitely be a good time. The Aether Snap combo is a very new archetype, so it feels fresh and new. So if you're not super worried about getting 25 wins this weekend, but you're trying to have a good time playing a fun new deck, then this could be a great choice for you. Now let's talk about Board Wipe Death. This list made by Nest was the top performing deck in the weekend ranked event last week. We're not going to go over Board Wipe Death too much. We've been talking about zombies for the past couple of weeks, but we have talked about Board Wipe Death a lot. The deck has existed forever. Pretty much everyone knows how it works. So we're just going to focus on the interesting parts of this deck, similar to the nature analysis. And the first thing that I want to go over is the Polyhymnia. I personally am not a fan of Poly in this meta. The only other control decks you're going to be running into is going to be the Board Wipe Death Mirror, where Poly doesn't really help you, the Deception versus Board Wipe Death matchup, where Poly is probably just actively bad. It's a great target for them to Cutthroat, and even if they don't Cutthroat it, they're going to deal with it with like some sort of ransom or bounce effect anyway, so it doesn't help in that matchup. And the same thing can be said with Ramp Magic. Ramp Magic will be the least prevalent of the three archetypes. However, Ramp Magic also has really no problem in dealing with Poly, so I'm not a huge fan of Polyhymnia in the meta. And then, besides those three matchups, most of the time you're going to be playing against very aggressive decks where you're not going to see 9 mana anyway. So more often than not, it seems like Poly is probably going to be used as a Siren of the Graves like throwaway target. And when you do run into those like control versus control matchups, you can win the game the way Board Wipe Death usually does, by just milling them really hard with cards like Sulfuric Rain, and then just using Jason to make your deck bigger than theirs, and or just finding your big value beat stick off of the Jason. So I'm not a huge fan of the Poly in this meta. That being said, Nest did win the weekend ranked event last week, so what do I know? He's got a 92% win rate. And the only other like real card of note in this Board Wipe Death deck compared to normal Board Wipe Death decks is the Necroceptor. Oftentimes, Board Wipe Death runs Kopesh and Pakri's Monster. This deck does not run Pakri's Monster, and therefore doesn't need Kopesh. And just like we've been saying, throughout this video, the meta is primarily aggressive. You have your aggressive light decks, your aggressive nature decks, your aggressive war decks, and those are the three big gods at the moment. And Necroceptor is really good at being an anti-aggro card. Worst case scenario, you're just going to get a 1/1 creature to contest your opponent's side of the board, and that creature has Leech. So it'll help, sustain your life total long enough for you to get to your super strong, like 7 mana plays in Apocalypse Now, as well as Demogorgon. And it's just something difficult for your opponent to deal with. I'm a big fan of Necroceptor in the current state of the meta for Board Wipe Death. I think it does exactly what you're looking for. But Board Wipe Death's been one of the best archetypes for a long time. Oh, there is one thing I want to note for this weekend ranked event, particularly with Board Wipe Death. When you're looking over, who's been performing well, if you see that Board Wipe Death has been doing well in the early parts of the weekend, it means that most of the light decks that you're seeing probably won't be running Radiant Dawn. However, once Board Wipe Death starts doing well, the light players will tech the Radiant Dawns into their decks, making the matchup essentially unlosable. So if you really want to play Board Wipe Death, I would suggest doing it on the first day of the weekend ranked event, because if you see that Board Wipe Death is successful, the light deck can easily tech against Board Wipe Death, and light is the most prevalent god. So you got to keep that in mind if you want to be playing Board Wipe Death this weekend. But besides that, it's Board Wipe Death. It's pretty great in every matchup besides light. It's not great against Slayer War, but Board Wipe Death is Board Wipe Death. Let's jump into the next archetype. And last but certainly not least, we've got Control War. This list was made by 3 question marks, and this is a really interesting mid-range war list. This looks like the creator of the deck just took an aggro war list and a control war list and just smushed them together. As you can see in the earlier part of the curve, we have some aggro war staples. We got the Adi as well as the 2 Raid Revelers, as well as in another round, which is a card that is never seen in the control or like mid-range control archetypes. And then when you fall down the curve, you can see we've got the control staples, the 2 Carnage Sweeps, the 2 Soul Survivors, the Hectors, a Strength in Numbers, even an Avatar of War. So you really got the best of both worlds. You can be very aggressive in the early game and buff up one of your protected creatures with that another round. And then you're incredibly strong in the late game with big tempo cards like Avatar of War, big value bombs like Strength in Numbers. You've got your Relic Removal tech, an Iron Tooth Goblin. Leviathan Hunter is, of course, here to combo with your AoE removal cards. It's a great target for your Soul Survivor. It also creates a 1-mana relic in combination with your Carnage Sweep. Of course, there is the very strange inclusion of a singular copy of Demo. Demo is almost never seen as a 1-of. It's almost always a 2-of. Just another wacky aspect of this deck. But if you're thinking, like, this guy's trying to do too many things at one time, I'd like you to take a note at his win rate. He has played almost 130 games with a 71% win rate. A few other people have also tried this exact deck list, and the win rate has actually gone up a little bit. So, despite the fact that this deck looks like it should whiff half of the time, it is very consistent. And some aspects are like normal mid-range control war list, but this is pretty wild compared to like your average control war list. Like I said, it feels like an aggro deck and a control deck just smushed together. But you can't argue with these numbers. He's doing great. This is a really interesting take on mid-range war. It is the best performing war deck over the past 7 days at Mythic rank. So if you like war, if you have this collection, if you're looking to get a little bit wacky with this like half aggro, half control, then this could be a really cool deck for you to try over the weekend. Okay, so now we've looked at the decks, we've talked about the meta, we've done all the thinking. What is the conclusion? Well, it's Light. Light has been the best deck for the last couple of weeks. It's going to continue being the best deck. If you have been on the fence about picking up some of the good Light cards, you might want to just go ahead and do it. This is the best archetype, and it is not going to change anytime soon. So, Light is the answer for now until the next set comes out, so it seems. But whatever deck you decide to go with, make sure you have fun. Tell us how you did in the TST Discord, and have a wonderful day. Hey, you! Did you know that subscribing to the TST YouTube channel will increase your win rate by 6.9%? So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And while you're at it, equip Scythe of the Harvest and attack the like button directly in the face. Bye-bye!